I'm going to ask Alex Wodak up in a moment to give a few reflections on Ethan's presentation. And Alex made a huge contribution to drugs harm reduction. In fact, we first met many years ago during the first emergence of the HIV epidemics, and we were both working on preventing harms amongst people who were injecting drugs. And Alex started the first needle exchange in Australia in 1986, I think, with the nuns at St. Vincent's Hospital. He helped to introduce the first safer injecting centre, medically supervised injecting centre in Australia. He's been involved in developing national research programs on drugs and alcohol in Australia, and he's travelled the world. I mean, wherever there are issues and governments to be persuaded and told about HIV and AIDS and so on, he's always there. Alex is now supposedly retired, but he seems to be working at the same rate as ever before. He's now president of the Australian Drug Law Reform Foundation, and he works full-time on drug law reform as a volunteer. We've had lots of discussions over the years about tobacco harm reduction, and from being a card-carrying drugs harm reductionist, I think you're now a card-carrying tobacco harm reductionist. So Alex, please come up and say a few words about what we've heard tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for asking me to come along and give this address, a brief address. I do want to thank you. I was hoping also to thank Pat O'Hare, as really some of the giants of this field have been for a long time. But in this field of harm reduction, which over time blurred into drug law reform, there clearly has only been one capo di tutti I capi, and that's, of course, Ethan, the boss of the bosses. And you've heard a blistering discussion by Ethan of the similarities and contrasts between standard drugs harm reduction and tobacco harm reduction. For me, the biggest difference, though, is the sheer impact that tobacco has on individuals and on communities. I don't know any other drug that can claim, as tobacco can, to cause the death of 2 out of every 3 people who use that drug. Even drugs like heroin and cocaine, which are regarded as the most dangerous of the illicit drugs, can't rival that kind of figure. And when we look at a global population with 1 billion people smoking in the world today, smoking cigarettes in the world today, and an estimated 1 billion tobacco-related deaths in the next 100 years. And when we think also of the huge economic cost that tobacco bears on our communities, these harms from tobacco are greater than the combined harm of alcohol and prescription drugs and illicit drugs in terms of deaths, disease, and economic cost. There's no contest. And yet, as Jerry and Ethan have argued, I think very convincingly, we've largely ignored those harms in the standard area of drugs harm reduction. Although, as Jerry mentioned, at the 3rd International Harm Reduction Conference in Melbourne in 1992, and as Ethan mentioned, we had that wonderful speech by Mike Russell, which was describing this pathway that Ethan's been spelling out for you, even before we had the tools to navigate that highway. It's been a challenging 25 years since that conference, and we've made a lot of progress, but in this area, all the progress has just been made in the last few years when the tools have become available. One of the, I think, strengths that we had in the drugs harm reduction area was the fact that we were alert fairly quickly to the fact that a lot of the harm that was being done with HIV spreading among and from people who inject drugs was happening in developing countries. now we're in a field in tobacco harm reduction where we're slowly getting on top of tobacco in the developed countries, where the problem of smoking is rapidly expanding still in the developing world. So it's going to be a real challenge to try and get tobacco harm reduction to spread as quickly as we can to the developing world. We've been lucky to hear a wonderful speech by Ethan, just going over these huge similarities and some considerable differences in the field. I hope that in the field of tobacco harm reduction, you learn from some of the mistakes that we made in the field of drugs harm reduction. But even beyond that, I hope that one of the things that we might get from the two fields working together is some symbiosis, so that in parts of the world that have been so resistant to drugs harm reduction and to drug law reform, we might, through the successes of tobacco harm reduction, get greater acceptance of drugs harm reduction and the need for drug law reform, just as I hope we will also have the opposite happening. We really need drugs harm reduction, we really need tobacco harm reduction. And in the drugs area especially, where so much of the harm has been done by the drug laws themselves, we certainly need drug law reform. One of the great lessons that we can learn from tobacco control policies is that it is possible to regulate a drug that has mass appeal. It is possible to use tobacco control with some costs to reduce the number of people in the community who smoke and who die and get diseases from that are related to tobacco. But how challenging it is now to learn that we can do much better by operating supply reduction, demand reduction, and harm reduction, and really meaning that third element, not just saying the words, because it's quite clear that tobacco harm reduction works. I was delighted to see in the last day or two the results of the decline of smoking in England, where the results are really very encouraging and do seem to show that the decline in smoking is accelerating in Britain just at a time when e-cigarette use is increasing. And similar remarks can be made in the United States. In my own country, daily smoking in people 14 years and older, we just had the results out from 2013 to 2016, just came out about 10 days ago, and these show a flatlining in a country where there is great hostility to tobacco harm reduction. So we've got a lot of work to do, and I do thank Jerry for really opening up this area in his retirement, and I thank Ethan for illuminating us with this dazzling oration showing the strengths and weaknesses of the two approaches. Thank you very much.